A very good evening, everyone. Welcome to the sixth talk of the Indophone inaugural talk series. I am Somdev Kaur, a faculty member in the Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Roper. Today we have with us Professor Jennifer Cole as our speaker for today. But before we introduce the speaker to you, I would like to begin with a brief intro to Indophone for the benefit of the participants who may be joining us today for the first time. So, Indophone is a talk series, as we see, but the main motivation behind the idea of Indophone was born out of awareness that there is a lack of a formal community within Indian linguistics that focuses on speech related research. Over time, we hope to build a collective of phonetics phonology enthusiasts to further research in these areas, and Indophone marks the beginning of this attempt. We are holding talks. We started in October last month, and we are steadily progressing with several very interesting talks. Uh, Parallel to the talks and the discussions that are just following the talks, we also have two platforms for the discussion, follow-up discussion, new ideas. One is NoCoda, which is hosted as a server on Discord. So you can follow hashtag NoCoda on Twitter for discussions around the talks we host at Indophone. We also have a Google group for the Indophone talk series. That is also a vibrant group for discussion. Please join us after the talk. There are five of us currently working behind the scene of Indophone. They are not here on the screen today, of course, but there is Professor Sakuntala Mohanto from IIT Guwahati, Professor Indranil Datta at Jadavpur University, Dr. Amalesh Gop at Tejpur University, Dr. Rinu Punus at IIT Palakkad, and myself, Dr. Somdev Kaur at IIT Roper. So the inaugural series, which began on 5th October this year, and it will end on 15th December this year. It boasts of an exciting lineup of experts working on the diverse aspects of phonetics and phonology in different parts of the world. Today, as you know, the sixth talk of the series will be delivered by Professor Jennifer Cole. Now, to introduce Professor Cole briefly, you can see her on the screen. I would like to say a few words about Professor Cole. She is presently a professor at the Northwestern University. She did her PhD in linguistics from MIT, and before joining Northwestern, she taught at Yale University and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She joined here in Northwestern in 2016. She is an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a fellow and distinguished lecturer in the International Speech Communication Association, and a Mercator Fellow in Germany. Dr. Cole was founding editor of Laboratory Phonology, one of the first open access journals in linguistics, and has served as chair of AAS Section Z, which is for linguistics, and member of the National Research Council Board of Behavioral, Cognitive, and Sensory Sciences. She is currently on the editorial board of Cambridge Elements in Phonology, the Bulletin of Synth Studies, which is published by Braille, and the Synth Journal of Linguistics from Karachi. At Northwestern University, Dr. Cole is Director of Undergraduate Studies for both linguistics and cognitive science. Those who are in phonetics and phonology, we already know that the area where Dr. Cole works, but to give a very brief understanding for the others, Dr. Cole's research investigates prosody and speech dynamics in human languages towards the goal of understanding the ways in which languages and dialects differ in their sound profile, and the cognitive systems that support real-life speech production and comprehension. Her current research includes collaborative work on prosody in individuals with autism and speech disorders related to neurological impairment, and a speech research infrastructure project to develop an open, scalable, data-driven framework. Dr. Cole's research has been funded by NSF, NIH, Department of Education, and the Volkswagen Stiftung. So, a very warm welcome to you, Professor Cole. Now, I would request you to take charge of the stage and please deliver your talk.
Thank you, Dr. Carp. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to you and your colleagues for organizing this really wonderful session. I'm looking forward to the discussion and eventually to meeting you all in person. So let me get started. There we go. So my talk is about prosody. So I want to just tell you how I'm defining this term because it tends to be used in different ways in the literature. So prosody refers to the melody, the rhythm, and the phrasing of speech. The melody in terms of the pitch modulation, the rhythm in terms of the modulation of local tempo or energy across words, and phrasing in terms of the grouping of words as indicated by the insertion of pauses or changes in voice quality, and so on. And the main question for prosody researchers, myself included, is what's the form and the linguistic function of prosody in languages? So what's the form in terms of the phonological representations that underlie prosody, or in terms of its acoustic expression or the articulatory dynamics that underlie it? What is the function, meaning what are the kinds of meanings that are conveyed through prosody? And what does all of that look like in all of the languages of the world? And I'm particularly interested in exploring with some of you, hopefully, what prosody looks like in the languages of South Asia. But before we can answer those questions, we have to figure out how. How can we investigate prosody? And my presentation today is actually focused on that question, but along the way, I'll tell you some of the things that I've learned in developing robust data-driven methods for prosody analysis. So let me tell you a little bit about what prosody looks like and what it's doing in language with reference to English, but then throughout my talk, I'll be bringing in some other languages as well. So we'll start with the notion of prosodic phrasing. So prosodic phrasing groups words together to reflect the syntactic and semantic dependencies among them. So for example, consider this sentence from English: voters approve urban renewal by landslide. It's a kind of sentence you might see as a news headline. And this sentence is ambiguous, at least two ways that we can illustrate here. On the top is the sort of questionable statement that voters are approving the use of landslides or the effect of landslides as a mechanism for urban renewal. Probably not. The second reading, and probably the one intended by the author of this headline, which by the way is a real headline, that voters approve urban renewal, and the way they achieved that approval or signaled it was by a landslide election. So the difference in meaning between these two syntactically acceptable structurings of the sentence, the difference in meaning is conveyed through differences in prosodic phrasing, and I've shown you the phrasing in the brackets here. And the prosodic phrase juncture between the word renewal and the word by in the intended reading can be marked by the insertion of a pause, by the lengthening of the final syllable at the end of the first phrase, by pitch movements, or for American English speakers, by the use of creaky or glottalized voice at the end of the earlier phrase. Okay, so prosodic phrasing is one of the main phenomena that we study in prosody, and the other phenomenon is the phenomenon of prosodic prominence. So prominence is the highlighting of a word so that it stands out from surrounding words. So for example, if we take the sentence, look for Rita over there, and if we assign a high level of prominence to the word Rita, then that might be an appropriate way to say the sentence in the context where you're searching for one person in a crowd. Look for Rita over there. But the same sentence with a different assignment of prominence on the word there, look for Rita over there, will signal a very different meaning. Okay, so you can see that both prosodic phrasing and prosodic prominence can carry a pretty important load in terms of signaling the speaker's intended meaning. And this has demonstrated, these two examples have demonstrated the use of prosody to encode information about syntax and also to encode information about semantics in the way of focus. And these encodings, we can characterize them in terms of phonological structures of phrasing and prominence through reference to a metrical grid, for example. And then in the phonetics, they're going to be spelled out through particular patterns in pitch, loudness, tempo, timbre, and whatever other phonetic dimensions we can consider. But syntax and semantics don't cover the full range of the meaning functions that prosody has. In English in particular, and in many other languages that have been studied, prosody also plays a role in signaling pragmatic meaning, and in particular meaning related to the information structure of an utterance. So let me talk for a moment about that. So information structure refers to how the referent of a linguistic expression should be identified in relation to the preceding discourse or the common ground of knowledge shared by the speaker and the hearer. So in English, this information structure is encoded through the positioning of the nuclear phrasal prominence, and that would be the word, a word which has phrase level prominence, so it's standing out from other words in the phrase, but in particular, the rightmost prominent word within a prosodic phrase. And that word will be marked by a pitch accent, which is going to involve a pitch movement. So here are some examples from English where I've used boldface to indicate the word that has the nuclear phrasal prominence. So in the first example, we have the sentence, Terry phoned the reporter. And if that sentence is offered as the response to the question, how was the story leaked? Then the whole sentence is new information, and the nuclear phrasal prominence goes on the rightmost word in the sentence. But if the same sentence can be offered in answer to the question, did Jonah leak the story? In which case the nuclear prominence shifts to the word Terry, because that's the answer to the question. No, Terry phoned the reporter. So that's a case where a word earlier than the final word in the sentence has contrastive focus, and by virtue of having contrastive focus, it has to receive the nuclear accent. And I hope you can hear the difference between these two versions of the sentence. Terry phoned the reporter on the top, and Terry phoned the reporter on the bottom. And the final example illustrates the phenomenon where a word which references information that's already in the discourse, it's already been introduced, so in other words, it's given information, such a word should not be accented, even if it's in a position to receive the default nuclear accent. So if we have, for example, the sentence, look at that reporter, I know that guy, then in the second sentence, I know that guy, the word guy must be de-accented. It must not receive the nuclear accent because the referent of guy is already been introduced. The referent of guy is the reporter, just mentioned in the previous sentence. So these three examples illustrate some of the important functions of accent placement in English to signal differences in information structure. Now, English works that way and uses prosody to encode information structure, uses prominence in particular, but not all languages do that. In other languages, information structure is conveyed through syntax or sometimes through lexical means. So let's consider another example. So I've already given you some examples of how English uses prominence. And so if you consider the sentence, the phone rang, if it's offered in answer to the question, why did you go in the house? Then American English speakers would say the phone rang with a prominence on the phone, prominence on the words phone and rang. But in French, the same question would prompt the answer, le téléphone a sonné. Okay, so I'm just here showing you where the prominences are in the French sentence. We would get a sentence, it's not very different from English here. We would get a prominence on the word telephone and another prominence on the word rang, on the verb rang. Okay, so at this point, the two languages look fairly parallel. But the same, but if we consider a different discourse context, so if the question was, what was making that noise, then in English, the sentence would be produced, the answer would be produced with the nuclear prominence on the word phone, because that's what's answering the question. So what was making that noise? The phone rang. So that's a different prominence assignment than in the previous example for English. But if we look at French, we see that French doesn't change the prominence assignment, but it changes the phrasing. So in French, the answer to this question would be le téléphone, il a sonné. So basically the telephone, it rang. Okay. And then the third example, again, in English, if we have the discourse context where somebody says, I thought he silenced his phone, then an English speaker can respond and say, well, the phone rang, with prominence on the word rang. But in French, that same sentence would have to be produced with a different syntactic organization. So the French speaker would say, il a sonné le téléphone. So now in French, the sentence structure has been altered to put the word ring earlier and the word phone later. Okay, so this is just to illustrate that prominence assignment is changing in English according to the discourse context preceding this utterance. But prominence assignment is not changing in French. The same words are prominent in each example, but the sentence structure has changed to position the words differently in phrases, and that syntactic positioning is actually signaling the information structure distinctions. Yet other languages use syntax and prosody together to convey differences in information structure, and Russian is such an example. So in Russian, if you have a question, the Russian version of the question, what's happening in the kitchen, then the answer could be a sentence, a simple sentence like, Ivan is cooking pizza, in which case the Russian sentence, Ivan gotovit pizzu, pizza would be the word with the highest level of prominence, phrasal prominence. So that is actually very much the same as in English. But now in a different discourse context, so if the preceding sentence says, Ivan and Andre found a new pizza recipe, and Ivan is cooking the pizza. So in English, you'll notice that I shifted the prominence to Ivan. So in Russian, you're going to have a different word order. So the sentence in this context would be pizzu gotovit Ivan. So you've got a different word order than in the preceding example. And Ivan is now receiving the phrasal prominence. So the information structure conditions trigger shifts in word order, but also that also involve assignment of prominence. Okay, so now we've seen that prosody is conditioned by syntax, semantics, pragmatics, but that's not the whole story, because we also know that out beyond these linguistic factors, the pitch and the tempo and the loudness of speech can be influenced by what we would consider paralinguistic factors, factors that relate to the speaker's affect or their emotional state, and also their identity in terms of their gender, their age, or other social affiliations that they might have. And these factors can influence the prosody in the phonological specification, but they can also have a direct influence on the phonetics themselves. Okay, so it's a very complicated picture. And so what we're trying to understand, just to go back to our initial question, is what's the sound structure of prosody, and what's its meaning, and what's the relationship between the two? So in order to explore that in all of the many different contexts that I've just briefly mentioned, we can look at acoustic measurements, like measurements of fundamental frequency or pitch, duration measurements that tell us about the tempo, local tempo, intensity measurements that tell us about changes in loudness. And these measurements can be drawn directly from the speech signal. We can also appeal to a prosodic annotation, a phonological specification of prominence and phrasing, which would have to be based on a phonological model of the language. Now, coming up with these phonological models is a lot of work, and that has actually only been done for relatively few languages in the world. But let me just give you an example from English about what that kind of phonological annotation would look like. Let's find my... Okay, so here I'm giving you in English the waveform and spectrogram and pitch track for two short utterances. Here's the first one.
A banana.
Okay, so hopefully you heard the word banana spoken as though it were a question. And we can see that the pitch starts out low and then rises up higher. And so the phonological annotation, phonological encoding of this pitch movement would include, for English, a low tone pitch accent on the stress syllable of the word banana, and then a sequence of a high phrase accent and a low boundary tone, specifying that there's a rise that plateaus at the end. And that example can be compared with this other way of saying the word banana.
A banana.
Which you can see has a very different pitch contour, and its phonological specification would include a pitch accent that has a low tone followed by a high tone to define this rise on the stressed syllable, followed by a low phrase accent and a low boundary tone defining the fall and plateauing at a low pitch level. That looks pretty straightforward, and you might be wondering, so what's the problem? This looks like a good system. And the problem is that, well, I chose these two examples to show you because these are the super clear, straightforward examples where we can assign a phonological tone specification to the pitch contours in a way that accords also with the way we hear these utterances. But we also typically observe much less obvious and clear pitch patterning when we look at spontaneous speech produced in meaningful phrases, sentences, and discourses. So here's a display. This display shows you a Pratt window with the waveform at the top, the spectrogram with a pitch track and an intensity track overlaid. You have the tone specifications in the text grid tier and some words, and then some specifications for the degree of juncture between words. And then at the bottom is a tier for noting any irregularities or questions. And this is the workspace of the annotator attempting to provide these tonal specifications. And what they're going to be listening to is something like this.
From the top of the mountain to between the old mill.
Okay, so this is an excerpt from a map task corpus, where somebody's giving directions to their conversation partner about a route on a map. And what I can just point out to you is that, first of all, the words come in very quick succession, as is the case in conversational speech. And the pitch contour, the blue line here, is actually kind of flat. So it's not very easy to see, big pitch rises and falls that we can assign tones to. And yet we have to identify that the tonal status of each word in this utterance. So the task is actually quite a bit more challenging. And people who do this kind of annotation, the system I'm showing you here is called the TOBE system, tones and break indices. It's oftentimes said, and the practice in my lab confirms this, that the amount of time that it takes to do this annotation for English is anywhere from 10 times to 100 times the duration of the sound file that you're annotating. And the experience in my lab is much closer to the 100 times end. So it's actually a very time-consuming task. One of the reasons why it's so difficult is that there's a lot of variation in the way speakers prosodify an utterance. And I'm showing you just one example. This was one that was on my desktop yesterday because I was examining some data from a recent experiment where we asked American English speakers to produce 8 different intonational melodies over a one-word utterance. And so each of these panels represents an individual speaker with the 8 intonation contours that they produced for us overlaid on one another, each contour in a different color. And what I'd like you to notice is that when you look across these 11 speakers, you see that the pattern of these 8 intonation contours is not exactly the same in each case. Some speakers are making bigger distinctions between the 8 contours. Some are making much smaller distinctions, and the shape of the contours themselves are a little bit different. Okay, so this was a highly controlled experiment where these speakers were told exactly what to say and how to say it, and yet we find this amount of variation. You can imagine then how much variation there would be when speakers are speaking freely using words and prosodic patterns of their own choosing. So prosodic variation is a well-known phenomenon, and in the variation that we observe in speakers' productions is a major source of disagreement among annotators in the assignment of prosodic features. And this comes about because different annotators may have different sensitivities to the acoustic cues to those prosodic features. They may have different sensitivities to the contextual factors that also influence the way we hear the prosody. And they may have different abilities to adapt to the speaker-specific or dialect-specific prosodic patterns. And any of these differences between annotators can lead to disagreements in what the prosodic specification of an utterance is, which then kind of becomes a barrier for research. So what we have here is a data problem. Prosodic annotation is resource intensive in terms of the people, the time, the money, and it requires that there be a linguistic description of the prosodic system before you can even get started. So by virtue of these constraints on prosodic annotation, it's actually in practice limited to very small data sets and very few languages. And then, as I've mentioned, acoustic measures are highly variable across speakers and utterances. And so modeling the variation that we observe in the acoustic data requires that we have a lot of data and really rather sophisticated means for extracting parameters from the data and performing statistical analysis. But we need a lot of data. So how do we get a lot of data when a lot of annotated data when the annotation process itself doesn't lend itself to scaling up? And so the solution that I've been exploring in the past roughly 10 years is to use crowdsourcing for prosodic annotation. Crowdsourcing refers to the assignment of a task to individuals who are not specifically trained for that task and who are not part of the research team. They're just ordinary people who sign up to do tasks for pay usually on computer internet platforms that organize these tasks and provide a way for payment. So I'm using crowdsourcing for prosodic annotation and automated methods to extract acoustic measures so that we can perform prosodic analysis at the scale necessary to overcome the variability that are inherent in the data we're analyzing. Okay, so the approach to crowdsourcing prosodic annotation is to take this very difficult annotation task and break it down into a set of binary coded, easy questions that can be answered by anyone. And I didn't invent this approach. This approach is actually widely used in artificial intelligence. So for instance, in vision processing, to get very complicated information about the world through a process that breaks that complicated knowledge down into very small bites of yes, no questions that can be answered. This approach bypasses the need for trained experts in exchange for gaining efficiency, much greater efficiency and lower cost. The prosodic annotation is done in real time. So as the annotator is listening to the speech, they are annotating it as the speech is playing. And the annotation is based only on auditory impression. So there's no viewing of the waveform, the pitch track, the spectrogram. There's no need for phonetic training to interpret those visual displays. The bonus that we get from this approach is a vast increase in the amount of data for which we can have perceptual prosodic information. And this large amount of data allows us to have richer and more accurate, eventually more accurate analyses. It's really fast, and that's what I like probably best about this method. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about the method for crowdsourcing prosodic annotation that I've developed, how we assess the validity of the crowdsourced annotation by comparing it to annotations performed under the controlled environment of our laboratory. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we've learned about the prosodic systems of some different languages through this method, with reference to English, Spanish, French, Hindi, Russian, and Papuan Malay. And a brief mention at the end of how we can actually use this method to compare the speakers' productions of prosody across different kinds of speech styles. Okay, so here we go. The methods for crowdsourcing prosodic annotation. The annotation method that I've introduced is called Rapid Prosody Transcription, or RPT for short. And in this system, listeners are listening to excerpts from speech recordings, and they are marking each word that they hear as prominent, and they're marking the locations where they hear boundaries between chunks of speech. This, as I mentioned, is an auditory annotation. There's no visual display, and it's done in real time. And I've given you some references to papers where we report on this method and results. The annotators are untrained. A key feature of this method is that we assign the same annotation task to many different annotators, so that what we get out of it is the average. We can get average information about the average prosodic rating for a given word based on the individual ratings of all of the annotators who were doing the task independently. And then in order to organize this task, we designed a custom web interface, which we can run off a virtual server. So the annotator can just link to the server, link to the web page. They're going to see some instructions and the consent form to participate in the work. And then they will see a print. Well, I'll show you on the next slide what they're going to see. I've given you a link here to our GitHub, where we have the current instantiation of this web platform. It's available for anyone in the world to access and use if you attribute your use to us. So that's the license that we've chosen. Okay, so this is a little screenshot of what the annotator would see performing rapid prosody transcription. So they're going to see a transcript of the sounds that they'll be hearing, the speech that they'll be hearing. The transcript has no punctuation in it and no capitalization. And all of the words are just presented in black. And as they're listening, they click the play button and they start hearing the speech corresponding to the transcript that they have. And every time, for every word that they hear as prominent, they click on that word and it turns red. And for every word that they hear, for everywhere they hear a boundary between two chunks of speech, they click on the word preceding the boundary, and then they will see a little vertical line separating the two words. And they can listen. In some versions of this task, we restrict the number of times that the annotator can listen to 2. In other versions, we let them listen as many times as they want. But they are free to change their mind by just clicking again on a word, and the prominence highlighting in red or the boundary insertion of that boundary mark will disappear. And the clicking just functions like a toggle. So you can change your mind as many times as you like until you move on to the next file. You can do rapid prosody transcription on any language that has a standardized orthography, because the annotator has to be reading that orthography, and that's the basis for the annotation. So this is a screenshot from a version of this task that we performed in a study of Hindi prosody. Obviously, then the annotators are Hindi speakers, and they're hearing Hindi speech, and then performing the annotation on this Hindi script. Okay, so what we get out of that, when we have, maybe 30 annotators all annotating the same speech, and then we can look at every word in the speech that was annotated and ask, what was the average number, what was the average rating? And that boils down to how many annotators said that that word was prominent out of all of the annotators. So we get a proportion from 0 to 1. And we can ask the status of each word for the number of annotators who marked it as prominent, or for the number of annotators who marked that word as preceding a boundary. And then I'm showing you here an entire excerpt. It's an English sentence, an English utterance that says, "I think that their personalities are different too, though. So he was very independent, but I'm not sure that's just his personality," or ... And then for each of these words, you can see that there are some words where we have very relatively high agreement that these words are prominent in red, and other words relatively high agreement that the words were at a boundary, a chunk boundary. And then there are also the words that have the average rating of 0, all the annotators agreed that there was no prominence and no boundary on those words. So that's one of the kinds of data that we get out of this. And then we can use these average ratings to probe hypotheses, test further hypotheses about the linguistic factors that govern prosodic phrasing or the assignment of prominence. Another thing that we do with the data is we look at an individual annotator and try to build a statistical model of that individual annotator's behavior in marking words as prominent as being prominent or at a phrase boundary. And then we can build statistical model of all of the individual annotators in our study and try to understand what factors seem to be playing a role within an individual and across the group of individuals. And rapid prosody transcription studies have now been conducted in many languages and many speech styles, including conversational speech, narrative speech, broadcast speech, read aloud speech. And we're asking many different kinds of linguistic questions with this data. So, for example, what are the effects of the acoustic cues versus the non-acoustic cues coming from the syntactic context or related to information status on the assignment of prominence? Or how does the linguistic function of prosody in a language affect the ratings of prominence and boundaries in that language? Or how do individual listeners differ in the cues that they attend to and select and the relative weighting of those cues when they perform this task? And we're also very much focused on establishing the validity of this method in relation to the expert phonological annotations, such as the ones I showed you earlier for English, and also by comparing how the RPT annotations differ when they're performed in a crowdsourcing fashion using a platform like Mechanical Turk versus when they're performed in our lab where we have sort of more control over the annotator's environment and their performance. So I'm going to now pivot to talking about how we're assessing these crowdsourced annotations. And so this was a study we did using rapid prosody transcription with American English. We took our speech materials from the Buckeye corpus, which is a corpus of conversational interview speech from speakers of American English residing in Columbus, Ohio. And we have 16 different speakers from whom we took short excerpts of between 13 and 24 seconds long for a total of 931 words that were annotated by each annotator. We had 3 cohorts of annotators. Each cohort included 32 annotators. None of them were trained, and they all used the same web interface to do the annotation, the interface that I've just shown you. The one cohort we call the Lab US cohort. This was a group of native speakers of American English, monolinguals, who were students at the University of Illinois, which is where I was when this study took place. And they came into our lab we paid them a small amount of money and they did the task. We also ran the same task on Mechanical Turk with the crowdsourced workers who were also native speakers of American English. And we restricted this task to crowdsourced workers who had IP addresses in the US. And then we ran the task a third time on Mechanical Turk, restricting the IP addresses to workers who were in India and whom we presumed to be speakers of Indian English. And then we actually did a survey at the end asking for the language background of our annotators, and we confirmed that they had to speak English in order to do the task because they were annotating English, but we also confirmed that through the surveys. Okay, so our question was, if you ask these, in these 3 different groups, you ask them to do the same task, marking prominences and boundaries using rapid prosody transcription, will they do it in the same way? And the first validation measure is just to look at the level of agreement among the 32 annotators in each cohort to see whether we get any big differences. And this is done through the statistical measure called Fleiss's kappa score, which takes into account not only the actual agreement on prominence rating or boundary rating for each word, but it also considers the chance agreement by considering how many words over the whole corpus are annotated, are rated as being prominent or boundary. And so we've got the 3 cohorts. The Fleiss Kappa scores range from 0 to 1, where 0 is the lowest level of agreement and 1 is perfect agreement. And the values from our study are in the fair to moderate range, but they're all significantly above chance because we have 32 annotators and we're asking whether 32 people agree on a binary question for each word. We can, however, see that the cohort from recruited from Mechanical Turk in India shows a lower agreement level on this task. And I'll come back to this in a moment. So the next question is, wait, how many annotators do we need to perform rapid prosody transcription in order to feel confident that we have captured the average prominence and boundary ratings from any random subset of people from that population, the annotator population? So we're looking for stable levels of inter-annotator agreement. And so the way that we did this was by using a bootstrapping analysis. We had 32 annotators in each cohort, but we imagined that, well, what would happen if we just took a random 2? We selected 2 annotators from each cohort at random, and we asked, did they agree? What was the likelihood that they agreed on the assignment of prominence and boundary? And then we randomly sampled 10,000 possible cohorts of 2. Of course, with 32 annotators, there's not 10,000 unique pairs of annotators, but we randomly sampled pairs from that 32 10,000 times, and each time we assessed their agreements through a kappa statistic. And then we did the same thing, randomly sampling 3 annotators from the group of 32, and then randomly sampling 4 and 5. And at each cohort size that we're sampling, we randomly sampled 10,000 times. And the question is, how many annotators do we need in our smaller cohort until we get sort of a leveling off of the agreement level as we look at each of the 10,000 different times that we sampled a cohort of that size? Okay, so I'm going to be showing you the results of this on graphs, and let me just orient you to the graphs before I show you what they look like. So on these the graph on top is going to be showing the variability in annotator agreement for boundary marking. And on the x-axis, we have the cohort size all the way from, it says 0, but we can't sample a cohort of 0. So we sampled starting at 2 and going all the way up to 32. Okay, and then the y-axis is telling you the standard deviation of that kappa score, which is the measure of agreement between each of the cohorts that we sampled, 10,000 different random samples at each cohort size. So this was done on a big computer. This analysis took several weeks with the computer running nonstop in order to, I think now actually the computers are faster. We could probably do it in a couple of days, but this was a big computational effort back in 2010. The bottom graph is just going to show you the same thing for prominence. Okay, so now I will show you the actual data. So first of all, I've plotted, each graph plots all 3 cohorts, but I'm going to step you through calling attention to each cohort separately. So looking here at the annotator agreement for boundary marking and looking at what point did the cohort that we recruited from Mechanical Turk achieve kind of a stable level of agreement. And we arbitrarily declared our threshold at a standard deviation of 0.05. So that means the average agreement level across all the 10,000 different cohorts that we sampled at this size, the average standard deviation gets down to 0.05. So for Mechanical Turk, that number stabilizes at about 7 or 8 annotators. And as we add more annotators, the number goes down, but it doesn't go down by a lot. The agreement doesn't go down by a lot. When we look at prominence ratings, again, we find it's about 7 or 8 annotators, maybe of slightly fewer, are needed to achieve this threshold of agreement. So that's many fewer than we actually used in our study. And it was good to know that we could do this study again with many fewer annotators and achieve something like a reliable result that we would expect to get the same result if we ran the study again. Looking at our annotators who were working in the lab under our direct supervision, but doing the same task, we actually find that they're more variable. So we need 11 or 12 annotators before we get a kind of leveling off of the agreement rate among different randomly sampled cohorts of that size. For 11 or 12 annotators for boundary marking, and about the same number for prominence marking. So the crowdsourced annotators are actually less variable than the annotators that we had in the lab. I think this is just reflecting the professionalization of workers on Mechanical Turk versus our lab annotators were university students that we brought in, and we paid them a little bit, and they really wanted to get out of the lab as quickly as they could and get back to their lives. So if I had to do this again, I would just bypass my university workers and go straight to Mechanical Turk and use the crowd workers. So now let's take a look at what happened when we recruited annotators from Mechanical Turk with IP addresses in India. So they definitely did perform this task, but we had to go to a larger cohort before we could see a leveling off in the agreement rates. So for boundary rating, the Indian cohort is actually not very different from the US cohort. So that suggests that in listening for cues to prosodic phrase boundaries, these two different groups of annotators are performing very similarly. But when we look at the Indian cohort rating prominence, we find that they're much more variable in the words that they rate as prominent. And we have to get to cohorts of about 20 before we see a leveling off in terms of the agreement levels. So this tells us that annotators from different dialect groups, because Indian English is a different dialect from American English, and bear in mind that they're annotating American English. So annotators from different dialect groups may judge prosody differently. They may hear it differently from those whose dialect matches the speech sample. And that's something important to know. So now we're asking the question whether annotators respond to the same cues when they're performing this task. And we want to make comparisons between our three cohorts in this study. And so to do this, we ran regression models to test the relationship between the annotators' ratings of prominence and boundary for each word and a set of predictor variables that we came up with. And then we compared the relationship between the predictor variables and the prosodic ratings across the annotator cohorts. So again, we had a predictor of cohort with 3 different levels. We had a set of predictors that were taking acoustic measures from the words, and a set of predictors that were non-acoustic factors that we could associate with each word. So the acoustic measures, these are all at the word level. We measured, for example, the local mean intensity of the word. That's a measure of the loudness. We measured the maximum F0 in the word. So that's a measure of the pitch peak attained within that word. We measured the local tempo. So that's a measure of whether the speaker is slowing down or speeding up on that word relative to the speech rate for the whole phrase. And then we measured the duration of a pause that may follow the word, if there is one. For the non-acoustic factors, we considered the word frequency. So how frequent is this word in a large corpus of spoken language? And this was important to us because work on English has shown that words that have low frequency in the language overall or relative to their immediate context have a greater likelihood of being prominent and getting a pitch accent because they're more informative. Words that have low frequency are sort of, by definition, more informative, and that has a prosodic spell out in English. We also looked at the part of speech because we know that adjectives and nouns are more likely to get accented than, say, function words, certainly, but even more likely than verbs in English. So we thought part of speech might be playing a role. And then we looked at whether a word was at the end of its prosodic phrase or not, because we know that that final position in the prosodic phrase is the default position for nuclear accent in English. So we thought that any one of these non-acoustic features might be influencing the annotator, who's also a speaker of the language. They might have expectations about a word being prominent on the basis of its frequency, its part of speech, or its position in the phrase. And those expectations could be influencing their judgment of prominence independent of the acoustic measures, and we wanted to look at that. And I should say that here we're focusing a lot on prominence because that's, of course, a more difficult annotation task. And what we found, just summarizing, I'm not going to take you through all the statistical results because you can look at our papers for that. But overall, all of these features were significant in predicting variation in the prominence and boundary ratings of words for all three cohorts of annotators. And we were able to explain 51% of the variation in boundary marking and 31% of the variation in prominence marking. The difference in these numbers, again, underscores the greater difficulty of annotating and even just hearing prominence distinctions in speech compared to the boundaries that mark prosodic phrases. Okay, so summarizing over when we did our comparison across the annotator cohorts, this is a summary of our results. We achieved stable annotations with small cohorts of between 7 and 12 annotators. If the annotators were spoke the same variety of English as they were annotating, and the crowdsourced cohort had the most stable agreement patterns. We found that similar cues informed the prosodic ratings for all three cohorts, although there were differences in the weighting of individual cues, which I haven't told you about here. Those are a lot of details in our papers. We found that the annotator's sensitivity to individual cues was very similar for the annotators who were working in our lab and the annotators who were working on the crowdsourcing platform. So we were concerned about just the different listening environment and whether that might privilege the acoustic cues for the lab-based cohort because we gave them over-the-ear headphones, but we found that no, that actually wasn't the case. And then finally, the dialect differences can affect prosodic ratings. The annotators who were representing a different dialect of English than the dialect that they were annotating were, in this case, less sensitive to the cues to prominence, and that showed up in more variability among these annotators. Okay, so now I want to pivot again and tell you about some of the comparisons that we found in the prosodic annotations across languages. So for American English, we know from our work and from a large body of literature preceding our work that a speaker is more likely to assign a word phrasal prominence and a pitch accent if sorry, let me back up. An annotator, I want to present this from the perspective of the annotator, an annotator or a listener is going to be more likely to hear a word as prominent, to hear accent, if the word has acoustic prominence, so in a pitch movement or in loudness or a slowing down of tempo, or if the word's in phrase final position, or if the word is highly informative because maybe it's part of speech or its frequency, its predictability, in other words. So we know that these are the factors that boost the listener's perception of prominence. But we wonder how much of our findings with respect to English are about English and how much they might generalize to other languages. In particular, what happens in languages that don't have word level stress? So English has word level stress, so maybe it's not surprising that listeners hear prominence in relation to the acoustic expression of the word, marking stress. Or what happens in languages that mark information structure, like focus, givenness, or topic, through lexical or syntactic means? So English really doesn't use lexical or syntactic means to mark information structure. We use prosody, but since languages differ on that count, maybe the role of information measures is less significant for other languages than it is for English in terms of predicting prominence perception. So we compared rapid prosody transcription prominence ratings for 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. And I'll tell you why we use these languages now. So first of all, they differ in these 3 languages differ in the placement of nuclear accent. And remember that the nuclear accent is always the rightmost accent in the phrase. There's no accented word that follows the nuclear accent. So in English, the nuclear accent is mobile because it can be at the end of the phrase, but it also can be earlier in the phrase, depending on whether a word earlier in the phrase has focus. In French and in Spanish, the nuclear accent is fixed. It's always at the end of the phrase, regardless of focus. And that's because focus is expressed through syntactic restructuring in French, as we saw earlier, and it's expressed in Spanish through word order permutation. So syntactic means are used in both cases, but not in English. Finally, second, in English, we can have additional accents preceding the nuclear accent, and that's optional in English. In fact, it's been claimed that the pre-nuclear accents don't convey information at all, that they're just sort of ornamental, or speakers employ them to have a sort of nice sense of rhythm in the language. In French, pre-nuclear accents are also optional, as in English, but in Spanish, pre-nuclear accents are much more frequent. They're pretty much contained on every content word. Every content word gets an accent. So you can have much denser accenting in Spanish, whereas in English or French, the phrases might have a few accents or lots of accents. It's sort of up to the speaker. And then finally, in English, accent is strongly related to the informativity of a word, whereas in French and in Spanish, accenting is very weakly related to the informativity of a word. It's got much more to do with the position of the word in the prosodic phrase. Okay, and here's just an example from English showing you dense prominences in a phrase where every word gets accented.
I really don't know.
Okay, so that's taken from the Buckeye corpus. And another example from the same corpus showing you sparse prominences. So relatively few words in this utterance are prominent.
I think the main thing that affects me now, and since I've been home.
And that speaker has got a very quiet voice. Just to illustrate that English has variable density of accents, of pitch accents marking prominent words. Okay, so summarizing some of the results when we were comparing across the Rapid Prosody Transcription task, and I need to pause to tell you that we had annotators from the United States annotating English text, English speech. We had annotators in Lyon, France, annotating French speech, and annotators in Spain. I'm just blanking right now on the name of the town, but we had annotators in Spain who were performing the task on Spanish speech. And we matched the speech in each of the three languages by drawing from a corpus of conversational speech in each case. So of course, it wasn't the same. The speech wasn't the same. It was spontaneous conversational speech drawn from three different speech corpora. So in each case, the annotators were native speakers of the same variety that they were hearing, that they were annotating. Okay, so now we're looking here at a plot that shows the relative contribution of three different acoustic measures to the annotator's assignment of prominence on a word-by-word basis. And you can see that as far as the duration of a word goes, all of the languages are paying, the annotators in all three of these groups were paying attention to word duration. It contributed to their, in the statistical model, it contributed to predicting their prominence ratings. We see that looking at intensity, well, English and Spanish annotators are paying attention to intensity, but French annotators are not minding intensity information very much. And we think that relates to the fact that in French, there is no word level stress. And so intensity is not varying terribly from one word to the next, as it is in English or Spanish, which have word level stress. And then finally, when we're looking at the maximum F0 or the pitch peak in a word, we find that English and Spanish annotators are attending to that information that cues their prominence rating, but not so much, English and French, but not so much in Spanish. And we think this may be due to the fact that pitch accents are so frequent in Spanish that they're actually not very informative. The pitch movement itself is not very informative about relative distinctions in prominence. So this is some of the just an illustration of the kind of information that we're getting from our prosodic annotations. When we look at other factors, the so-called non-acoustic factors, here we find less similarity among the languages. So for example, for the English annotators, the word frequency, our measure of word frequency, which is a proxy for the informativity of a word, that's a very huge factor in influencing the annotator's rating of a word as prominent. You can see that this factor reaches like almost 1 in effect size, and it's a much less significant factor for French and Spanish annotators. The part of speech varies. I'm not really going to dive into our account for why these vary so much across language, but we think it has to do partly with word order differences within syntactic phrases in the languages. But we found it very interesting that the factor of whether a word was final in a prosodic phrase or not, that had about the same influence on prosodic prominence ratings for all three languages. And we didn't really expect that, because while in French and Spanish, it's always the case that the word at the end of the phrase gets the nuclear accent. So there we thought maybe the presence of a boundary would be a good cue that word is also prominent, but we didn't expect that it would be a good cue in English, given the mobility of nuclear prominence in English. But we found that it has a strong effect. The presence of a boundary has a strong effect on prominence ratings, and it's quite similar across the languages. So from this, we conclude that listeners perceive a final structural prominence in a phrase, even when that doesn't convey information about focus, and even when it's highly predictable, that still influences the prominence ratings. Okay, then here I'm giving you a graph that shows the agreement, the kappa scores that measure the agreement among annotators for a large number of studies that have been done using rapid prosody transcription. The first 4 bars are for different studies on English, and I've already spoken about them. The next 2 bars are for French and Spanish, and I just told you about those studies. And the last 4 bars are for individual studies that have been done on Hindi, on Russian, and on German and Papuan Malay. And the references for these are at the bottom. I was involved in all of these projects, except for the project on German and Papuan Malay was carried out by independent researchers, but all using the Rapid Prosody Transcription system with the same interface. And what we find is that, well, there are differences in the agreement among groups of annotators, but it's particularly interesting to note that the lowest level of agreement, and these are just for prominence ratings. I'm not showing you boundary ratings here. Boundary ratings are much more uniform and consistent when we look across languages. Prominence ratings are where we find the greatest variability. So Papuan Malay speakers rating prominence on Papuan Malay speech show very low levels of agreement among independent annotators. And the authors who did this study believe that this reflects the fact that in Papuan Malay, there is no stress. There's no word level stress and no phrase level stress. So the whole notion of prominence as signaled through the phonology or the phonetics is just it's not a construct in Papuan Malay. It's not a grammatical construct. It doesn't express itself in the phonetics. And so we're actually seeing that reflected. So this low agreement level for the Papuan Malay study is actually good news, because you would have predicted this based on the assessing the phonology and the phonetics of the language in relation to stress. Okay, so now let's see if I have a few more minutes. I'll ask a few more questions about our RPT data. So one question that we wondered is whether prominence is being rated on the basis of the phonology and the phonetics that the annotator is experiencing, or whether they're really focusing on the communicative function of prominence or boundaries, but here focusing mostly on prominence. The communicative function in relation to signaling syntax or signaling focus or signaling information structure. So we thought we would test this directly by running our experiments with 2 different sets of instructions for the annotators. So on one hand, we asked the annotators to mark prominences based on specific acoustic qualities they hear. We told them, listen for pitch variation, listen for loudness. We told them what to listen for. And then in a separate task, we told the annotators to mark as prominent the words that seem most important for the meaning that the speaker intends. And so we had them focusing on the communicative function of prominence. And then we compared the prominence ratings from the same annotators performing the same rating task on the same speech, but under 2 different sets of instructions. And we did that for English, for French, for Spanish, and for Hindi. And the 2 bars for each language, the yellow bar is showing you the agreement rate among annotators when they were annotating prominence on acoustic criteria. The green bar is showing you the agreement rate when they're annotating prominence under the so-called communicative criterion. And for English, French, and Spanish, we get higher agreement rates. Sorry, for English, we get higher agreement rates under acoustic, but only slightly higher. For French and Spanish, we get much higher agreement rates among annotators when they're annotating the prominence related to the meaning function. But what was really interesting is that English was actually the Hindi results. So Hindi, similar to English, showed actually no difference. Let me back up. Hindi showed no difference in the agreement rates, whether annotators were focusing on acoustic criteria or communicative criteria. English speakers showed a small difference favoring acoustic criteria, but for Hindi speakers, it was the same. And this actually really surprised me. And then when I thought about it, it made perfect sense, because what we know from other people's work on Hindi pitch analysis is that in Hindi, the meaning functions for conveying the methods for conveying distinctions in focus and information structure rely primarily on lexical and syntactic configurations. So the use of lexical particles marking emphasis, or just primarily changes in word order to position words that are more informative later in the sentence and words that are less informative earlier in the sentence. So where we say that acoustic prominence relates to communicative prominence for English and Hindi, much less so for French and Spanish. Okay, and then another way we thought to try to tease apart the difference between prominence perceived on the basis of its phonological or phonetic expression or prominence perceived on the basis of the communicative function was we asked our annotators to rate prominence, giving them only the text and not having them listen to the speech at all. And then we compared that with prominence rated on the basis of the speech signal. And here we have data from English, French, Spanish, Hindi, and now Russian. The Russian study had this manipulation as well. And you see for all of the languages except Hindi, we get much higher levels of agreement among annotators when they are annotating the speech signal and marking as prominent the words that are important for the meaning of the utterance. When they are annotating the text only without the speech signal, we call that silent annotation, their agreement is much lower. So they don't necessarily converge on the same ratings, except for the Hindi annotators. For the Hindi annotators, they're annotating the prominent, they're rating words as prominent in the same way. They're achieving the same and relatively high levels of agreement between annotators, whether they're annotating the text alone or the text with the speech. And again, we think that that reflects the fact that word choice and syntax are encoding prominence in Hindi to a much greater extent than in these other languages. Okay, and then my final comment, a very short pivot here to talk about prosodic annotation and stylistic variation. And we might wonder, well, you know, all of our studies so far have used conversational speech. That's what our annotators are annotating. But conversational speech is just one style, and it has its own recognizable prosodic patterns. So what happens if so what is the prosody like in other styles of speech? To get at this, we compared RPT prominence ratings from crowdsourced annotators when they were rating a TED Talk, which is an emphatic public speaking style, versus when they were reading conversational speech from the Buckeye corpus. And what we found, comparing the TED Talk is the emphatic speech, the Buckeye corpus is the conversational speech. The TED Talk, and this is just a bar graph showing you the frequency of accented and unaccented words. And this is based on an expert sort of Toby labeling of these materials. So the TED Talk speaker over here on the left uses more pitch accents, and this speaker actually uses a lot of the very high rising pitch accents, which sound very prominent to an English listener. Here's a sample of the TED Talk speaker.
A few years ago, I felt like I was stuck in a rut.
And you can hear he's really emphasizing a lot of words. And in the conversational speech, many more words are just not accented at all. When we looked at the pitch values of words, we found that the TED Talk speaker has a larger F0 range and many more words with high pitch peaks compared to the conversational speech that was taken from a dyadic conversation. The speakers are talking to one another at close proximity. So more accented words and bigger pitch excursions with higher pitch peaks. That's the TED Talk speaker. So what does this mean for the annotator marking words as prominent? Well, we were really surprised to find that the annotators gave lower word prominence ratings for the TED Talk than for the Buckeye corpus conversational speech. Even though the TED Talk speaker had more pitch accented words, a bigger pitch range, it seems that the annotators calibrated their prominence ratings to the speech style and actually downgraded the information coming from pitch in particular compared to the performance using the same task on conversational speech. So what we've learned about prominence from these crowdsourced annotations is that across languages, listeners attend to similar acoustic cues to prominence. However, the non-acoustic factors, while they also play a role, they differ across languages in a way that reflects the linguistic functioning of prominence in that language. We found that acoustic prominence aligns with prominence related to the meaning of words in some languages, much more so than in others. And we find that the perceptual rating of prominence varies with contextual factors like speech style and speaker engagement. And overall, our take-home messages over all of the studies, ours and others, is that rapid prosody transcription provides insight into the perceptibility of prominence and phrasing. It's not reliant on a prior phonological model of prosodic features. And so it generates some really great hypotheses for testing those models in follow-up studies. Crowdsourced prosodic annotation with RPT offers a low cost and efficient method for assessing prosodic prominences and boundaries in speech. It scales up. There's no limit on the amount of speech that you can obtain and annotations for. Using RPT, crowdsourced prosodic annotations can be obtained for any speech style and any language that has a written form. It doesn't require a linguist behind the scene making difficult decisions informed by visual displays of the speech signal. It can be performed by anybody with normal hearing who's able to read and mark up the printed transcript. Thank you for listening. I want to give a nod to Tim Mart and Chun Chan, who developed the software that we use for running these experiments on the internet. And you're welcome to access that software and use it yourself. And I hope you do. And if you do, I hope you let me know what you find out. Thank you.
Well, that was such a wonderful talk, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm sure the audience, we had a very good audience today, and I'm sure they got a lot of new information on the techniques of prosody annotation, particularly the rapid prosody transcription. The RPT is a game changer, I would say, in the prosody-related studies. And now, Jennifer, there are a few questions from the audience. I would like to put them one by one for you to look into. And okay, so this is our first question. I hope you can see it, right?
I do see it, yes. So,
Oh, please.
yeah, so Preeti is asking whether annotators might be biased by their individual perception of prominence. Absolutely, yes. So individual annotators' bias is something that we are interested in. It's one of the reasons we like this approach, because we can actually run this task on any speaker of the language as an annotator and to probe their individual predisposition, which we would hypothesize it's going to reflect their own language experience with their first language and with other languages that they may be in contact with. We definitely expect that to be the case, and we think these data could be an interesting, they could inform studies of how language background influences the way you perceive prominence in any language. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Emma. The next question is from Ankita, and this is here.
Mm-hmm. So this question is about how we see the influence of different kinds of metrical structures like dactyls, trochees, and iambs influencing linguistics as they do in literature. We definitely have appealed to these structures that are found in poetry, for instance, when we try to understand the rhythmic patterning, the stress patterning in spoken language. And I think that we do find some evidence that there are correspondences, and it should be unsurprising. We think of poetry as the creative use of language, but whatever we're doing with language and poetry has to draw on the same sort of cognitive mechanisms that support our use of language in everyday speaking contexts. So in a sense, you might think, since it's the same cognitive mechanisms that are giving rise to stress patterns in speech and rhythmic patterns, metrical patterns in poetry or prose, that since it's the same cognitive mechanisms, we would actually expect there to be some strong correspondences. Our RPT method doesn't actually, we don't actually invoke notions of particular metrical structures like dactyls or trochees, but you could use our results, and we have actually, to look at, for an individual annotator, what are their patterns? Is an individual annotator giving us strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak patterning, or strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak? And we can look for those patterns at the level of individual annotators. We have found some evidence that individual annotators mark prominence in a way that minimizes stress clash. In English, there's a lot of opportunities to get adjacent syllables with primary word level stress through concatenating words and phrases. And we find that listeners are likely to not mark prominence on words that would have adjacent stress syllables. Instead, they'll leave one of those words as not prominent, even if the acoustic signal suggests that maybe there was stress on those two adjacent syllables. So yeah, it's a nice question. And
it's a very excellent response to that as well. There are a couple of questions from Sharmishta Sarkar, and here is the first one.
Okay. So I did show you a slide, and I said that participants were instructed to utter sentences in specific ways. That was from a study, not a RPT study. That was from a study. So that I showed you that just to illustrate variation in the production of intonation in that particular study. In the RPT studies I showed you, the prosodic annotations were always being made over conversational speech that was produced spontaneously in a real communicative context, so ecologically valid speech. Ultimately, that's what I'm interested in. And so that was the kind of speech that we used in our RPT studies. Right now in my lab, I'm running some experiments using an imitation paradigm to elicit speech as an imitation of a heard sentence. It's a completely different project, and I'm not using RPT in that, but I'm using that imitated speech as a way to see, like, when people are trying their hardest to control their production, to produce a target that's been made explicit to them, under that sort of ideal condition, do we still see variation? And the answer is yes. So that's interesting.
Right.
I want to see what varies and what doesn't, but that's separate from the RPT study. So sorry if I confused you on that. Happy to talk about that, about whether you get natural productions or not from that. Actually, we got very natural productions from our imitation study, but that was because of some clever instructions that we gave to our participants. We told them they were hearing computer synthesized speech, which actually wasn't true. They were hearing speech produced by a human with resynthesized pitch. But we said, this is computer synthesized speech. We know it's not very good yet, and we're trying to make it better. So please reproduce what you hear, but in a natural way. So we actually explicitly told them to speak naturally, and they complied. They were very natural in their production. So, but again, a separate topic from this RPT.
Right. And her next question is something to do with the word orders in Indian languages, particularly the Indo-Aryan group.
Right. So Bangla, Hindi, all of the Indic or Indo-Aryan languages have richer morphological structure, at least with respect to case marking and some verb modality. But I think that, and that's important, but I think probably more critical for comparison with Germanic and Romance languages is the fact that you can have really free ordering of word, not completely free, but you can have many different permutations of word and constituent order in a sentence. And they're conditioned by the pragmatic context. So the particular word order that you use for a given sentence will depend on what information is being emphasized or is new. And that can definitely affect potentially the position of the nuclear accent. Frankly, for languages, for work that's been done on Hindi and Urdu, I don't think we know, or Bangla, I don't think we really know that there's a nuclear accent, that's a very big distinction in the way that it is for Germanic and Romance languages. it's not obvious to me that there's an important distinction between nuclear and other kinds of accents. But I think we could probe the question if we get more data. And RPK is one way to get more data. Yeah. Thank you, Sharmista.
Yeah, and there is a different language here in question now, Malayalam, from Professor Hemlata Nagarajan. So here is the question.
So right, so he's asking about Malayalam, whether what's important about the location of the boundary, whether the clefted phrase forms a separate IP or not. Exactly. So when you have syntactic restructuring, as is used in French, then you have major. I mean, you can think that the syntactic restructuring is, in a way, perhaps being driven by the need to have a different prosodic phrase structuring for the sentence, and so you can achieve that by using clefts. And having a different prosodic phrase structure is definitely going to change the status, the accent status of words, or their prominence status. So I agree that phrasing is very important. And in fact, there's some really interesting work being done by the French linguist Caroline Ferry, who's developed a theory of prosody that's intended to apply across languages, where she says really, the prosodic marking of focus is really all about phrasing and the location of phrase boundaries. And there's an alternative analyses of English and Germanic languages, Romance languages, that really put the emphasis of explanation on prosodic phrase boundaries, not on nuclear prominence. And it's an interesting proposal, but it's an analysis that works very well for languages like French and Malayalam, and many other languages that use phrasing. I should mention, English has this option. We have cleft sentences. We can say things like, it's the phone that rang instead of the phone rang. But it turns out that clefting is not as common as prosodic encoding of information structure in English.
Okay, thank you. Now we have next question from one of our Indophone colleagues, Shakuntala.
Yes, I'd like to know the results for Hindi. So, yeah, the status of stress in Hindi is controversial. And my own, I've done a little bit of probing on that question myself in Hindi, also for Sindhi. My own feeling about Hindi stress, again, as sort of an outsider looking at the range of studies that have been done, is that there may actually be differences between speakers in different regions, Hindi speakers in different regions, and probably reflecting the interaction of Hindi with other local languages that may be giving rise to some of those differences. So whether Hindi has fixed stress or not, I think may boil down to, we may want to talk about Hindi languages instead of like a one Hindi language in that respect. But stress cues may not be perceptible, right? So to the extent that Hindi has stress, then at the word level, then it's not as perceptually salient as in Germanic languages or in a Spanish, Italian, or Portuguese, for instance. It's not nearly as salient. And you can then see in acoustic measures, there's not as much differentiation between stressed and unstressed syllables. So it would be unsurprising then if in annotating prominence, Hindi, that a Hindi speaker would be a Hindi-speaking annotator would struggle maybe a bit more to decide if a word is prominent or not, if the acoustic cues are just not there. And I think almost certainly that was playing a role when we asked our annotators on Mechanical Turk who are working from India to annotate American English. I expect that that was one of the things going on, was that they're really tuned into the acoustic cues that are very important for speakers of American English to differentiate stress levels.
Right. Thanks, Jennifer. So there are a few more questions. Can you take a few more?
Yes, yeah, I can.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Dr. Niranjan Uppur. It is about the annotation and annotators.
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Uppur. So, of course, your questions really just inspire more work. We did restrict our annotators to an age range between 18 and 65. 18 is just for legal reasons that we can't pay minors to do work. It's more complicated. But 65 is a cutoff just due to the prevalence of hearing loss among older individuals. And I'm unfortunately now entering into that phase myself, and I can experience some reduced sensitivity and hearing. But I think actually it's an interesting question. If you want to know how does hearing loss affect a listener's ability to track prosody, RPT would be a really great way to test that, because you could actually do RPT with people and measuring their auditory processing at the same time. Age, so I've spoken to age groups. Yeah, so we have imposed some controls, but minimal. I think though dialectal control would be very important, since our findings suggest that if the greater the distance between the annotator's language and the language that they're annotating, then the lower the agreement levels will be among annotators. So the annotations might not be as informative for linguistic research. And so restricting the annotators to those individuals who share the same language, speak the same language variety that they're annotating, that's probably important. Although I have a colleague in Japan who's using RPT to assess how well Japanese ESL students, so learning English as a second language, to assess how well they're actually learning the prosodic system. She's having the Japanese speakers who are struggling to learn English in college, she's having them do RPT on English. And we don't train our annotators at all, not at all. We give them instructions that we say, I left this out of the talk for time, but we say speakers will sometimes make a word prominent in the sense that it stands out from the other words nearby. That's all we tell them. We just say speakers sometimes do this. We don't tell them why or what prominence is. We just say, please mark the words you hear as prominent. And then we reassure our annotators that there's no one right answer. And we're really interested in how different people might hear the prominence. So we want them to feel comfortable doing what they hear. It's a auditory first impression that we're looking for here. So we don't train them at all. However, we have also had trained Toby annotators. So I'm trained in the Toby system. I can do this for English. And I've done RPT, and other people in my lab have done RPT to see whether our RPT annotations differ because we have more knowledge, and they actually don't. When you're doing this task in real time, the speech is coming in so quickly that you're just trying to really deliver your immediate auditory impression. You don't have time to strategize and reflect on what you know about the language. So we don't train at all.
Yeah, and Niranjan has a kind of connected question here.
So the minimum number of annotators was a question we were really interested in because it costs us money to have more annotators. So that's why we did that study assessing agreement levels for different annotators of different group size from 2 to 32. And for American English annotators annotating American English speech, I'm very comfortable with using 10 annotators now because our assessment showed that we reach a threshold of agreement at about 7 or 8 annotators. So I would just jump up to 10 because it's a nice round number. However, you would have to do that kind of assessment in a different, if you wanted to use RPT for a different language and use a smaller number of annotators. But I would guess as a starting point, 10 to 15 would be pretty safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what would you respond to this point that Niranjan again has? I think this is his last question.
Yeah. We don't always use crowdsourcing, but I'll say that it's actually not time consuming at all. The crowdsourcing is the least time consuming way to do this study because we put our speech materials up using our web platform, which we share with everybody. It's actually pretty easy to use. We put our speech materials up. The listeners click through, they click on the words that they hear as prominent, they click on the words where they hear boundaries, and that data gets then saved in a log file, which we transfer to a spreadsheet. And our data are just within seconds of the experiment being completed, our complete data set is ready for statistical analysis. And we have a pipeline for statistical analysis that we can complete that within a day. So I can complete an entire experiment within a couple of days that used to take me 4 to 6 months. So it's not time consuming. A lot of work went into building the system, but now that the system exists, using it as a snap and we're sharing it with anybody. But crowdsourcing isn't always available if you don't have internet access if your participants aren't comfortable using the computer. And so you can also do it with paper and pencil. You can have a printed transcript and be playing the speech from a recorder or a computer, and your annotators can just mark the printed transcript. But if they do that, so that's very low tech, but then you have to have someone convert the markings on the printed transcript to a spreadsheet, and then you can do your processing. And then, of course, that allows errors to come in. So we prefer not to do that, but it is definitely an option. I think the group in the study on Papuan Malay, they may have, no, actually they used computers too. Yeah.
So in these last few months after the pandemic started, what's the trend? Like people prefer still doing it on computer, or?
We have to. In the United States, there's no research being done with, no linguistics research, to my knowledge, being done with human participants coming into our physical lab space.
Right.
We aren't. I haven't been to my campus since March, and my students haven't either. 100% online. So we've taken all of our experiments online. So we're kind of ahead because we were already doing our experiments online. Our perception experiments. Now we're taking our speech production experiments online as well, and that introduces other challenges. But
Indeed. We have a couple of questions from Professor Preeti Rao. Let me.
Hi, Preeti. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Hey, great. You're using RPT. How exciting. And Preeti, you actually heard a version of this talk when I visited you. Was it a year ago, 2 years ago? I know it's hard to keep track of time. So recommendations for rater training. Well, we don't train our raters, but if you want to get, we have actually looked at, we did a study where we compared all of our 32 annotators on the English task with the expert Toby annotators to see which RPT annotators were marking prominences that best matched the Toby annotations. And we saw that that there is variation. We do have some super annotators who just natively, naturally, and instinctively seem to hear and pick out the prominences that are also revealed in a Toby annotation. But we didn't train them, and we couldn't figure out any features that they had that set them apart from the others. So at this point, I don't really have any specific recommendations for rater training. I still use the Toby annotation method in my lab, mainly to try to, I want to put it to rest. I would like not to have to use it for English because it's so resource intensive. And I'm currently training a very bright undergraduate student to do Toby annotation for English. And I've budgeted about 20 hours of one-on-one training between me and the student, which is just very impractical. Like, how often can I commit 20 hours to training someone on this task when they'll be able to label so little data? So training is a big headache. I much prefer not training. I much prefer developing methods that don't rely on human expert annotators.
Right. So Professor Rao has a follow-up question here.
Oh, so perceived boundary suggests prominence on the same word because of the pattern that the nuclear prominence, which is the perceptually strongest prominence in a word, will always be the rightmost, and that in the absence of any special focus conditions, that will always be at the end of the sentence, at the end of the prosodic phrase. So that's the default pattern for English, that the last word in the phrase will be the word that gets the nuclear accent. And you must have at least one accented word in a phrase. And so that puts a lot of emphasis or a lot of burden on the last word in the phrase. So if you know that a word is at the end of the phrase, it's very likely that it's also the nuclear prominence, unless there's a focused word earlier in the phrase. So that's the nature of that relationship.
Okay. Well, here it deserves a mention that Professor Preeti Rao was our second speaker in the Indophone talk series.
Yes.
And we are glad to see she's actively participating in the other talks as well.
Preeti, but if you have some experience with training annotators for RPT and you want to share with me the best practices, I would really welcome hearing what you've been able to do.
That's great. Jennifer, we had one last question, which I actually missed. It is from Sharmishta, who had a couple of questions earlier. So with that, I think we'll end.
Oh, yeah, in tonal languages. So, right, Sharmishta is asking about what happens in tone languages. I keep track of the literature on prosody and tone languages, but I don't myself work on a tone language. But I believe that this notion of nuclear accent is really not it's not an operative construct in a tonal language. There's prosodic phrasing, and then each word that has a lexically specified tone can scale that tonal movement, that pitch movement. And the scaling of the pitch movement might depend on the prominence level of the word, but there's no pitch accent. I mean, you don't get a tone or not get a tone based on that. So yeah, I guess I can't really answer the question because I don't have any direct experience working on it, but I would just say that the whole notion of a nuclear accent is not really operative at least in the Chinese languages where I've read about work on prosody. It's more happening with the phrasing. I think more happening with the phrasing.
Okay, thanks. One last question came from Indranil, again, our Indophone colleague. Here
Yeah.
it is.
How would you implement RPT in a language without an established orthography? We also know very little about the prosodic phonology of that language. Yeah, we've thought about this. You know, I don't know. I think it's extremely challenging to imagine this. One system that has been explored by Petra Wagner, not using RPT, but using something kind of similar. She had participants tap on a drum, on an electronic drum, to prominences as they hear them in the speech. And so you don't need to read the transcript to be listening and tapping on a drum. The problem is that the drum tap is going to happen a little bit after they hear the word where they hear a prominence. And so you have to model that time delay. It's an interesting method. She has a paper that came out in Journal of Phonetics special issue last year, where she reports on, I think that was the one, reports on this drum tapping method. So that might be one option. I think it's challenging. If you have ideas, I would be keen to know, because obviously we know that, you know, probably many, if not the numeric majority of languages in the world don't have an established orthography. And so taking this research to those languages remains a challenge, definitely.
Right. Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. Here, just few thank you notes. I would like to just flash here for a moment.
Thank you,
Yeah, so Hemlata and then
thanks.
Preeti Rao. I think some of them had questions, Niranjan, and then of course he didn't have a question, but in general gave a thanks and mentioned that Punjabi.
Yeah, I haven't worked on Punjabi, but I would be very interested to. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that some of you may become interested and reach out. Either do this on your own or reach out to me. Would be very happy.
So as far as I know, Dr. Dharamveer works at the PGI Hospital and Medical College in Chandigarh, which is in the speech language area. So anyway, thank you so much, Jennifer. We have a very small token of appreciation here. Let me just very quickly put it here. Oops, just a moment, please. Okay, so I am sharing my screen here, and this is hand sketched work.
Wow.
So this is done by one of the MA linguistic students at Tejpur University. Her name is Koel, and she is a student of one of our Indophone members, Dr. Amalesh Ko. And this is
thank you. That's
done for you.
What a very talented artist. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for sharing that.
So we'll share the copy with you.
Thank you. That's really nice.
And we're glad you liked it. And for the audience, once again, please follow up the discussion, not only Professor Cole's talk, but all the talks on phonetics and phonology that are going on Indophone platform. So please join on NoCoder Discord server and our Google group server. The links are given here. So, yep, that's all from our
Thank
end.
you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And with this, we'll end the session here, and we'll go offline now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks to the audience.
Thank you.